2002 through 2006 Lexus ES300 transmission service and filter replacement. I'm Brian from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps for replacing those parts. To get started, you're going to need to get the front of the vehicle up in the air. If you're doing this at home, use floor jacks and jack stands and jack up the front as high as you can. Now we're going to get underneath here, and this on the driver's side is the transmission. We're going to take the drain plug out and get the transmission fluid draining. You're going to need a 10mm Allen socket like this. So go ahead and remove the drain plug bolt here and get it draining. I wanted to share with you the parts that you're going to need to do this job. So you're going to need a drain plug gasket, and you're going to need a new transmission pan gasket, and you're also going to need 4 quarts of Toyota Type 4 transmission fluid. I will link up all these parts in the description of the video. Now we're ready to start dropping some of the bolts on the transmission pan here to get it down, but there's a couple of them that are really difficult to get to. They're underneath the subframe here. So I'm going to show you how to get those bolts out. So on the driver's side of the subframe, there's these little plastic covers here and here that are covering up a couple of the bolts to remove the motor mount nuts. So you're going to pick these little covers off, and inside will be a 15mm nut. You're going to remove that one there, and I'll pan back here so you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. So you're going to remove the bolt there, the nut there, and there, not the two that they're kind of at an angle, the ones that are vertical. So you're going to remove those 2 nuts. And once you get those 2 nuts, then there's going to be a third one right here on the left, just to the front of the control arm there. So go ahead and remove those 3 nuts. And I'm using my little Milwaukee impact gun here to make quick work of that. But you can use hand tools, whatever you got, to get these off. But go ahead and remove those 3 nuts. I'm also using a 17mm socket to remove these nuts. So once you get those 3 nuts removed, on the front of the subframe here is one more motor mount that we need to remove the nuts from. So there are only 2 nuts on this one, and they're 14mm nuts. So you'll need a 14mm socket. This Milwaukee 3/8 drive impact gun here is the perfect tool for doing jobs like this. I will link it up in the description of the video also. Now that most of the transmission fluid should be drained out by now, so I'm going to go ahead and change out the washer and put the drain plug back in and tighten it back up. That way it's not dripping on me when I'm working on this. So I'm just going to give it a good wipe down and then install the new washer onto the drain plug here. Screw it in and tighten that up with the 10mm Allen socket. So you'll run this into it snug, and then in about a quarter turn or so more, that's all it takes. You'll kind of feel the crush washer crush down a little bit. Now towards the back of the transmission is the differential portion of it. I'm going to use a block of wood, and I'm going to use a pole jack, and I'm going to screw the transmission upwards. You can use a floor jack if you're doing this at home. So you'll put the floor jack with a block of wood right there. So the block of wood protects it from getting damaged. And we're going to lift the engine up and transmission up just an inch or so. And that'll give us enough to get in there to get to those hard to reach bolts. So I'm jacking this engine up, and now I'm going to use a wobbly socket, a 10mm wobbly socket with an extension here. And I'm able to get right in there and get to those hard to reach bolts. So Milwaukee Tools has sent out this brand new 2nd generation M12 impact driver here. So I'm testing out one of the modes that it has where you switch it into a low power mode. And what you do is you squeeze the trigger and it slowly rotates out. It controls the amount of RPM that the tool can produce. So you can get to hard to reach fasteners like that and control the wobbly socket. So once you get those hard to reach bolts out, then you can just go ahead and remove the rest of the remaining bolts with a straight shot at them. And once you get all the bolts removed, then we're going to lower the pan down. So I have a bucket directly underneath me, and I'm using a pry bar, and I'm going to give it a little light pry like that, and the pan should pop down. You also want to be prepared to jump out of the way because it will splash some fluid. So once you get the pan out, right here is a filter. It's what it really is just a screen. So if it's dirty, I recommend you change it. I will link it up in the description also. But mine is clean. I'm only doing this because of a oil leak, basically. So I'm repairing the oil leak. So we're going to go ahead and clean up the pan, clean up the surface on the transmission. And we're also going to check for any debris in our pan. So there's going to be 3 magnets in the bottom of the pan. So you're going to check them. If there's any large debris stuck to them, that is the sign of a problem. But if you see a little bit of fine shavings like you see on mine, that is a normal condition, and you only want to do is clean it up, and you don't have anything to worry about. But if you see large chunks of metal, then you have a problem. To clean the pan and remove the gasket, you can use scrapers like these, or you can also use a roll-lock disc with a die grinder and buff the old gasket off. You also want to clean up all the bolts to go to the pan. I just use a little bit of brake clean. I put it on a rag and just spray them down and wash off the transmission fluid. So go ahead and clean up the transmission pan, and then you can clean up the body of the transmission here itself by spraying it off. If there's any gasket on there, you can scrape it off and wipe it all down and get it good and clean. So when I cleaned my pan, I also peeled the magnets off and wiped all the shavings off of those. Now you can reinstall them with the little hash marks are. Basically, you just put them back to where you got them from. And then once you got that all done, now you need to prep the gasket. And what I like to do is put a little small thin bead of black 3M super weather adhesive, and that'll glue the gasket to the pan here. And the way I make sure everything is all lined up with the bolt holes and stuff is I take the bolts and I put them through the holes here on the gasket and through the pan here. And once it's tacked up, then I'll remove the bolts, and now everything's perfectly lined up. Now we're ready to put the pan back up onto the transmission. A tip is to put blue thread locker on the bolts, and this will help prevent these bolts from vibrating loose and backing off and prevent leaks in the future. I will link this up in the description along with the 3M weather stripping adhesive. So now, before I put the pan up, I'm just going to give it one last good wipe down and make sure that the transmission here is completely dry of any transmission fluid dripping down. Then I'll quickly position the pan back up into place, and then I will start all the bolts by hand and run them in until they're snug. Now that all the bolts are back in the pan and run in until they're snug and the pan is basically just touching, now we're going to tighten them all down. We're going to do this in a crisscross pattern. So I just pick a spot and start, and I'll run the bolt in until it's snug, and then about a quarter turn or so more. You don't want to over tighten it, but you also don't want to smash the gasket where it spreads all out and stuff. So it's just kind of like a snug feeling. And then I'm going to go on the opposite side, and I'm just going to work back and forth, tightening up all the fasteners. Once that side, then I'll work back and forth to front to back, front to back. Now that you got all the bolts in the pan tightened, you can go ahead and lower the pull jack or the floor jack that you are using to jack up the engine and transmission. So you go ahead and just lower it straight down, and then once it's all the way seated, then you can go ahead and remove the floor jack or pull jack, and then you can go ahead and start the bolts for the mounts. Before I put the nuts back on the mounts, I like to put red thread locker on these. This gives them a little bit more secure hold so they don't back off. So I'll go ahead and run those back in until they're tight and tighten them up. I just used my impact gun here. I tried looking up the torque specs, but my source did not provide the specs for these bolts. So I'm just going to run these in until they're tight and snug. Once I get all the mounts re-secured, then I'm going to put the little plastic covers that covered them up here on the left side of the subframe. So I'll just reinstall these little plastic covers, and then you can go ahead and wipe down and clean up everything here. After that, we're going to lower the vehicle down, and we're going to fill up the transmission here. So on the driver's side is the red dipstick. We're going to remove that. We're going to install a funnel, and we're going to fill it up with 3.5 quarts of the Type 4 transmission fluid here. So once you get the vehicle filled up with about 3.5 quarts of the transmission fluid, we're going to go in the car, start her up, let her idle for a few minutes, and then once it's idle for a little bit of time, then you can go ahead and run the transmission here through all the gears. So I like to pull them into the gear and let it sit for a second or two, and then pull it to the next one, and then just keep slowly shifting it through all the gears. And then once you get to the bottom, just go back up in reverse, and then just let it sit in each one of the gears for a second or two before you move it, and that'll get the fluid circulating through the transmission. Now with the engine still running, I'm going to check my fluid level here. So you may have to dip the dipstick in quite a few times to get an accurate reading. You want it to be right here in the cold section here. Once it's in the cold section here, now it's in a safe range where we can drive it. And once it drives, the transmission fluid will heat up and it will expand, and most likely expand to the perfect level. If it's not after you test driving it, I recommend topping it off. You want to do it in small increments. You don't want to overfill it. This vehicle ended up taking about 3 3/4 of a quart to be completely full after the test drive. I will link up all the parts and tools in the description of the video. I also wanted to share with you that How To Automotive has a tool store, and I will link that up in the description also. I'm Brian Eslick from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos, encourage you to subscribe, invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.